but let's get started. We'll start with the Pandemic Recovery Plan. So earlier this year, during the legislative session, the legislature appropriated the clerk $6.25 million statewide of non-recurring general revenue. So again, that is appropriate on state fiscal year. So it became effective July 1st of this year, and it will expire after its 12-month period next June on the 2022. It is distributed and released quarterly, so we can't spend more than our quarterly release each time. So we get 25%, 25%, 25%. And that's for both of those funding sources. So for the Pandemic Recovery Plan, the purpose of it is to address the backlog of cases that we had after facing the COVID-19 pandemic. And as a note, we will be requesting year 2 of this funding, $6.25 million, the same amount that we got this year for next year. So Jason and the legislative team will hopefully bring home another $6.25 million. So this funding was in conjunction with our partners at the courts. They got $9.25 million to go along with our $6.25 million to help address these cases. Same deal, they got non-recurring one-time general revenue. And I do believe that they are asking for the same amount this year. I would defer to Jason on that. So how did we come up with the allocation by county for this funding? We worked with our partners over at the courts, specifically the TCBC, Trial Courts Budget Commission. So we worked with them to see how they were going to allocate their funding and where they thought the most cases were from the backlog. As kind of a weighted cases, multi-year distribution. So we just piggybacked with that, used that methodology, applied it to our funding source, and that's how we came up with the quarterly distribution amount by county. And as always, our forms and memos, anything related to this and anything else we do is always available at the CCOC website there in red. Okay, so this is important. That's why it's in size 95 font. Please ensure that 100% of these allocated dollars for your county are fully expended by June 30th, 2022. We can't carry any of this forward. It's just one-time non-recurring funding. So again, please just make sure that we fully expend this generous funding after the 12-month period. And as a reminder, we can't expend more than 50% right now. So we're currently in the second quarter of the state fiscal year. So we can't spend over 50% to date, but please make sure we've spent that 50% by the end of December 31st. So we've got a lot of good questions on what can we use these funds for? What can we use them on? So the main thing that people are using them for are hiring temporary staff to work these cases, using them for overtime hours related to working cases, attending additional court hearings, salary dollars of staff that are working cases. So if you don't have temporary staff, if you don't have any overtime hours, if you're a small shop, any of your employees that are addressing cases, you can apply this to their salary dollars first, use that, and then use your CCOC budget for the remainder. And anything else specifically related to working these cases, that's what this can be used for. So there are 2 forms related to tracking this. The first one is the signed certification letter through the JAC. It's similar to all the other certification letters that we do. But again, this form is quarterly, and it's due at the beginning of each quarter and submitted to our reports email there in red. The certification letter for quarter 3 will be due December 20th. So that's coming up. That's a little different than what we did for quarter 1 and quarter 2. But this way it's before the quarter 3 starts on January 1st. That way it gives us a week and a half to hopefully get these approved by the JAC. And that way we can have those dollars available as soon as the quarter starts to maximize the amount of time that everyone has. The second sheet is the expenditures tracking spreadsheet. It's an Excel spreadsheet. And it's filled out at the end of each quarter and submitted to the same reports email by the 20th of the following month, which is when all of our reports are due. I'm sure as everyone knows that. And as a reminder, the expenditure spreadsheet for the second quarter will be due January 20th. There's one issue I wanted to bring your attention to, and it had to do with the state fiscal year versus the county fiscal year. and tracking Q1 of the state fiscal year, which is the fourth quarter of the county fiscal year. We got a lot of feedback from a lot of you guys and a lot of different counties that they did not want to track this funding in two different county fiscal years, which is completely understandable. So what 48 counties did was defer their Q1 funding to the second quarter. And that way you don't have to track anything for the first quarter, but with the understanding that in the second quarter that we're currently in, that you would expend Q1 plus Q2, so 50% by December 31st. So there again, an important note, please make sure you've expended 50% by December 31st and 100% by June 30th. There will be a test at the end of my presentation. And again, you cannot expend over the released amount. We had a few counties in the first quarter expend more than 25%. So I will be reaching out if that was the case. So again, for the quarter that we're in, please ensure that of your county's allocation that 50% is expended. 50%. All right. Before we get into jury funding, I'm going to pull up the, does anyone have any questions before I pull up the form? Oh, can we bring you a mic? Sorry. 50%. Test. You're saying like total before the actual cases versus the work that we did to get down to that number? No, it was mainly based on, that's a great question. It was mainly based on work that was done prior and then kind of what the courts, where they thought a majority of it would be. And I think the estimate they used at the time was 1.2 million cases that were backlogged. But again, I don't think there was an actual list of where those cases were by county. But that would be great, but that'd be a lot of tracking and I just don't think they were able to capture that. But great question, thank you. Any other questions? All right. So this is the certification letter. Again, it looks like the rest of our certification letters that we do. Pretty simple. It's one page. You just fill out the appropriate quarter, date it, and then the clerk signs it, and then you send it into our reports email. For the tracking spreadsheet, this is probably our most complicated form that we have. But like the rest of our forms, anything in green is what needs to be filled out, and in gray is hard-coded and locked and automatically calculates it. So you pick a county, and we will randomly pick DeSoto. Is anyone from DeSoto here? They can't defend themselves. All right, so you just select your county from the drop-down box. You type in your full name. I won't spare you with spelling my last name. And then you fill in your email. And so DeSoto deferred their Q1 expenditures because they only want to track it in one fiscal year. So they didn't need to send anything for the first quarter, but they fill it out for when they send it in the second quarter. So they had no personnel and no operating. And again, we gave two different levels of tracking, but we rolled it up for ease. But most of the funding, 99.9%, will be personnel, but we wanted to give you an option if you did have any operating expenses related to working these cases, so you could break that out. We haven't heard of any that I'm aware of, but if you have any, that gives you that ability to break it out from personnel. But for this scenario, we will assume that DeSoto had nothing. They deferred their Q1. So then now at the end, by January 20th, when they send in their Q2 form, they hired temporary staff and they spent 50% of their funding. We'll get there. So that their total allocation was $7,849. So they spent 50% on their temporary staff. Right there, they did not spend anything in operating. So that is the form that they would send in to us on January 20th. So then at the end of quarter three, state fiscal year quarter three, in April, by April 20th, they spent the 25% that they got allocated for the third quarter on temporary staff. They didn't spend anything on operating. So that's what they would send in quarter three. And then by June 30th, so 20 days after that, so July 20th, they have spent 100% of their total funding. So there it goes. It calculates the 7,849 was their total allocation for the year. They've spent everything. They had zero for operating. And this is the final form that they would send in by July 20th for the year. And then again, hopefully we'll be able to fill this form out again next state fiscal year if we were able to get the 6.25 million again. Is there any question on this form? Yes, sir. Hello. That's a great question. Yes, it will likely be audited by DFS and then also JAC, since the state appropriation is through JAC, they will likely ask us for documentation proving that we spent 100% of our funding and what we spent it on. And we did approve these forms through the JAC that they were appropriate to track. But we have an aggregate form that we will compile all of these forms in to see, personnel operating by quarter, and we'll have that tracking. So if anything does come up, any audits, we will have that tracking. So great question. Thank you. Any other questions? All right.